That time again, that time when we walk into the virtual bar and see what kind of conversations or debates might be out there today. We're your hosts, Richard, Ken, and I'm Chris, and this is Three Pastors Walk Into a Bar. Greg's on vacation. It's still. It's like, how long does he have to be on vacation? Good grief.
Doesn't that qualify as a hiatus?
I think it's sabbatical. I think if you're gone more than 3 days, it's a sabbatical.
Around here it should be.
For sure. But today we have joining us Associate Pastor Richard Alderson. What's happening, Richard?
Nothing much. Glad to be back finally.
Yeah, it's been a while. Been a minute.
It has.
Yeah. Like, what was the last one that you were on? Like over a year ago, huh?
I think it was like the third or fourth one.
Third episode. We ran you off.
Yes.
Yeah.
You argued with Tim, right?
Yeah. He was arguing with Tim about music, and then he was like, I'm done with this.
Yes, these guys, losers.
These guys listening to all this.
These rap and hard metal people. I can't hang out.
All this non-country music. How dare they? Of course, I don't know. There's a lot of rap and country music these days.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't be a professing country music fan either, though.
Me neither.
Yeah.
I despise country music. That's a strong word. I shouldn't say despise. I have a particular disdain for country music, only because of that one instance where I was told that Christian music is fine as long as it has a country beat. When I was a kid, and then so like at that point I was like, oh, is that so? Well,
yeah. No, it's funny. Before, not to get off topic, but I had never thought about country music in that light growing up in the South until you mentioned that. And then once you start listening to it, it's like, wow, it's about all this adultery, then going to church on Sunday, and it's crazy how much demonic teaching is in the
country
most popular
music.
country music.
It's crazy. And then, that's kind of like what I was saying that one day when I was talking about it in my sermon. I was like, well, at least heavy metal is honest enough to tell you what it is,
Right.
At least it's like, hey, look, we're devil worshiping music. Just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's Laodicean church right there. Be hot or cold. Don't be lukewarm.
Oh, man. So 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 through 4. For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions.
Or music.
Wow.
Nice.
Yeah, this sounds so much like what I think of when I think of the church in today's society. And we'll turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths. So we have been going over this worldview survey that Barna put out. Well, actually, it was Arizona. It was a university, Arizona Christian, that put out this Barna survey. And it was showing some pretty terrifying things. In part one of this episode last week, we looked at the results of the American Worldview Inventory survey that pertained to parents. And it was pretty shocking. Some of the things we found out: 9 out of 10 parents of children under the age of 13 have a muddled worldview. 2/3 or 67% of parents of preteen children, which are millennials mainly, claim to be a Christian, but only 4% of them actually possess a biblical worldview. Think about that for a moment. They're the people who are raising up our next generation, by the way. Almost 6 out of 10 dismiss the Bible as a reliable and accurate source of God's truth. Just 4 out of 10 parents of preteen children believe the Bible can be trusted as God's accurate words for humanity. Even so, fewer than half of those individuals actually read it.
Just sounds good. Sounds good to me.
94% have a worldview known as syncretism, which is basically a blending of a bunch of different worldviews. So, and when we're talking about worldview in this scenario, what we're talking about is, when we make choices, we rely on our sense of right or wrong, our sense of good and bad, what's useful or useless, appropriate or inappropriate, and we use those to produce what we believe to be the wisest choices in any given circumstance. So a biblical worldview, in a nutshell, would be thinking like Jesus and applying the answer without concern for how we anticipate the world will react. Does that sound about right?
It sounds, I would just qualify it with a biblical worldview would be one that is in submission to biblical truth. So any truth that is revealed by the Bible, you submit to that, whether you initially agree with it or not. Because I think the thinking like Jesus can be a slippery slope, because I don't know that really the Bible defines how Jesus thinks. It defines what he did and what he said.
Do you think that Jesus didn't have a biblical worldview?
Well, obviously he had a. Well, that's tricky. Let's say technically speaking,
technically he did not.
He did not. The Bible wasn't canonized at that point. But for our era, I think that's what I define a biblical worldview is: if there's a truth in the Bible, a command, you submit to it, or you're striving to be under submission to that.
Yeah.
It's more of a grid, right?
Right.
Yeah. That's why I asked that question, because I was thinking about it earlier. Because we have a lot more canonized scripture after Jesus ascended up into heaven that qualifies the bulk of New Testament thinking. And there's a lot in there that is Christ-like in its thinking if applied to him as a person in the Gospels. But there's also a lot that Jesus did not even address. In reality, I was reading something somewhere, I forget who it was, but the whole point of this guy's paper was that Jesus and Paul didn't teach the same religion.
I've heard that a lot.
And partially that's true, because part of what Jesus was doing is he was teaching the gospel of the kingdom to the Jews. Part of what his whole ministry was is telling them that he is the Messiah, and that they were going to reject him, and they could have had the kingdom if they had just accepted him as the Messiah. But of course, he knew that they would not, and so that's all part of that. But then you go into what Paul teaches, and a lot of what Paul teaches, you actually don't find Jesus mentioning, even though the characteristics are like Christ in some of the things that he taught, and so. I think the mistake that people make is that Jesus kind of laid out the foundation, and then Paul kind of laid out the minutia of it in his writings, I think is what it boils down to. Like we're going through Hebrews right now, and Jesus, said that I have not come to destroy the law, but to complete the law. Well, Hebrews is all about how that happened. It's the very specific outline of how the old law was made obsolete by the new law that was created in the new high priest, who is Jesus Christ. And so I think that people can get really confused with that. But, having a mindset of Christ-likeness is certainly something that Paul promoted.
So you could say they both reached out to people with two different worldviews.
Oh, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. And
so
Paul,
different worldviews take different methods.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus reached out to all those people groups as well, but his primary focus was the Jews, obviously. Right. Paul, he reached out to both as well. I mean, he was
Hebrews being the exception to most of what is.
It was mostly to Jews, but all the letters to the churches were written to different groups of people, different people groups, and so Paul was a true multinational missionary. Like you don't see those today, actually.
Not too much.
So I don't want to divert, but a tangential, and maybe you're trying to imply this, but I think that when people try to point out, well, this is Paul's gospel, this is Jesus' gospel, I think it's part of what we're talking worldview. Have you run into the people who are like, well, if Jesus didn't say it, then it doesn't apply.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's like you're saying, like you preached about yesterday with Hebrew, it's missing the complete flow of God's continuing revelation that's now closed with the Bible. But they're missing the fact that it's like the red letter Christian, right? If Jesus didn't say it, it doesn't apply to me.
It doesn't apply, yeah.
Right, and it's definitely not how it's said. And you talked about in Hebrews, Christ had to die to enact the new covenant. So obviously someone else had to come and complete the teaching on the new covenant, because he came to ratify the covenant and to begin it. So,
which is probably why Jesus appeared to him in the first place in a very special type of revelation,
right?
You know, because he knew that the work had to be completed. You know, the words had to be completed, and Paul had to do it,
right?
You know, and so I have run into those people though that they dismiss all of Paul's writings as being completely, you know, not even applicable. You know, it's like only the Gospels and maybe John, you know, only because it's prophecy.
Right. Yeah. And those are the ones that typically diverge from the gospel message.
Yep.
As if John 3:16 doesn't link so cleanly with the gospel message of Paul.
Yeah. Yeah. It's bonkers. Yeah. There's a whole big discussion there for sure. The American Worldview Inventory Survey, kind of getting back to our point, annual survey that evaluated the worldview of U.S. adult population age 18 and over, conducted by Arizona Christian University Cultural Research Center, led by George Barna, founder of the Barna Research Group. I love saying that name, Barna. Based on 54 worldview-related questions. And these questions were drawn from categories like biblical truth and morals, faith practices, family and the value of life, God, creation and history, human character and nature, lifestyle, behavior and relationships, purpose and calling, sin, salvation, and God relationship. The survey is the first survey of its kind to measure not only the biblical worldview of Americans, but also competing worldviews like secular humanism, postmodernism, nihilism, Eastern mysticism, Marxism, critical theory, moralistic therapeutic deism, syncretism, the list goes on and on and on. Those are all branches of like the main ones. And we talked about that last week, kind of the main line, like dividing worldview philosophies and how that all branches out from that. So I'd encourage you to go back and check that out. The methodology was they sampled 2,000 adults, 68 questions in the data set from 1,000 interviews with random sample adults via telephone, plus another 1,000 who completed interviews online as a national panel. The study among pastors refers to several segments of churches or denominations or families. Examples of denominations included mainline Protestant, which would have been American Baptist, Episcopal, Evangelical, Presbyterian, Church of Christ. Then you have Evangelical, which would be Baptist, Bible Fellowship, Free Will Baptist, Southern Baptist, most of your Baptist conventions. Lutheran? Really?
Missouri Synod.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Presbyterian? I don't think I would consider Presbyterian church in America to be evangelical.
Presbyterian Church in America, Presbyterian Church USA. Must be.
I think I would have considered them to be Protestant, but yeah. I guess, I mean, I don't know. I honestly have no idea how they draw these lines and create these categories. Like, I understand, like, like there's traditionally black, so African Methodist, Episcopal, AME Zion, National. You ever been to an AME Zion church service?
I have not.
They are a hoot.
Not a Zion, but I've been to an AME service.
Have you?
They're a ton of fun.
Yeah, they are. I remember the one I went to. The guy in Pensacola was pretty popular, and he'd be preaching, and they almost like singing like, "Hey, we going to hell," kind of like saying that they have the guy in the background with the piano or the organ. And he's like,
Yeah.
And then
embellishments.
And the whole service is like that. They're like amping people up and stuff. Well, this guy, I'll never forget it. I've included this in sermons before, but he had a elder, this old kind of little tiny black gentleman with his tuxedo on and white gloves. And when the pastor would say something, he would do like these hand gestures and then end it with a point, like he was pointing at somebody. Like, this applies to you.
This for you, brother.
This applies to you, you know? That was so much fun to watch.
That would be fun.
And then you have charismatic and Pentecostal, Assembly of God, Church of God, Foursquare, holiness churches, Christian Missionary Alliance, Church of God, Church of the Nazarene, Salvation Army. Salvation Army is considered holiness?
Yeah.
That's interesting. I have no idea. Seventh-day Adventist. So that's kind of how they did the sampling. So last week we talked about parents. This week we are going to talk about, and let me make sure that I'm hooked up to the Bluetooth here because we got some clips, and I should have done this earlier, but I'm lazy. And so, all right. So let's see. Is that up over there? All right. So let's hope that works. We'll see if it works. Anyways. Last week we talked about parents. This week we're going to be talking about pastors. And in a quote from George Barna, from a worldview perspective, a church's most important ministers are the children's pastors and the youth pastors. Discovering that 7 out of every 8, and I don't understand that phrase, first of all. From a worldview perspective, a church's most important ministers are the children's pastors and the youth pastors.
Well, I think he means from a worldview development perspective.
Right.
Forming the worldview of the future adults and leaders.
Right.
Do you think there's
As
a lot
mission of the church?
Do you think there's a lot of worldview development going on in junior church?
Not much.
Yeah, well, I think that's the point.
Typically.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I'm saying is like, I mean, is that really a thing? Like, are these kids really getting their worldview development from youth pastors and children's pastors? I mean,
they are. But if I may, I remember it when I was an instructor at the basic school. So the basic school of the Marine Corps was every Marine Corps officer had to go through a 6-month learn to be a provisional rifle platoon commander. And as an instructor, there's a lot of obviously expectation and pressure for you when you taught your class or when you gave your instruction, to be spot on. I mean, it's the Marine Corps. That's the way I was expected. And I remember we had this lieutenant colonel who was leading us. We called him the Oracle because he could just predict stuff that was going to happen, like just inner unit
spooky
stuff. And he was just a real observant guy and just a real kind of sage kind of guy who could talk to you about stuff. And he would take us aside as instructors and say, hey, you need to realize that it's not what you teach. It's what these lieutenants experience that they're going to carry with them. He said, let me give you an example. Tell me any period of instruction you remember from high school. You couldn't do it. But he said, tell me what high school was like. And you could verbatim was, it wasn't fun because, societal pressure, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the point of Barna's making is even though there's no overt development of worldview, their worldview is being developed, whether they are planning to or not, or whether they do it or not. It's the experiences they're having. And so the experiences they're having with the youth pastor, who's only the youth pastor because there's not an actual preaching spot for him, or he's, going through purgatory before you can become a normal pastor, right? Because
right.
Yeah. So those children's worldview are being developed, and the scary
by
thought
their
is
experience.
Exactly, by their experiences. And so when they're seeing all this bananasness, they're not. I mean, would you say? Let's go a little bit. Someone who comes from Catholic or LDS, isn't that always a challenge because they've seen the hypocrisy of what happens in the religious experience, but they see what happens behind closed doors. So on the face of it, they're like, I already know this is a bunch of baloney, so I don't even want to listen to you.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, I can see that. That actually makes sense to me. But how much of that is actually the youth pastor or the children's pastor, and how much of that is just the collective experience that they're gaining from the kind of like community itself? Because I can think back on I was impacted deeply as a child in my church experience as my biblical worldview, especially early on, but I'm not sure how much of that was a result of my youth pastor. In fact, I can barely remember any of my actual youth pastors. I can remember one junior church teacher that was impactful to me, simply because I remember the things that she used to do. But as far as like developing my worldview, I wouldn't say that she had any part in that, and neither did any of my youth pastors. However, I would say that my experience with the church community in general definitely helped to develop my worldview.
I agree, and I guess what I'm reading out of that is, I agree, it's the collective community that's driving that worldview.
Right.
And now as that worldview is departing from Christianity, now we don't even have a youth pastor who's flowing against the stream. The youth pastor is going with the community.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And so there's nothing there for that kid to say, oh, in fact, it's reinforcing the fact that, the culture must be right because that's just what my youth pastor's like.
Yeah.
That was the big deal, was being culturally relevant.
Yeah.
We need to have a context that they can relate to. Well,
yeah.
No. That's not what we're trying to build.
There is definitely a falling away of the youth department in general. I don't know what happened to youth departments. We have a philosophy about youth here that we hold to. I'm not sure that it's the right way or not, but it's working for us. But there was a point in history where youth became a separate thing. It was like youth became its own entity. You had to have a youth pastor, and you had to have a youth room, and you had to have, all the youth activities, and you had to have, and there was this big effort to bring in kids from the community, bring in youth from the community. And my dad was a part of that with the bus ministry too. There was this huge push to bring the youth and the kids in, almost like the youth was the evangelistic arm of your church. And what we discovered was that was a complete failure, and now we're looking at youth departments now. And when we were reviewing youth departments for our church and how that's going to look, we looked at all the other youth departments and thought, well, what's going on there, and what is the benefit to the discipleship of children in that group, And when I was sending my kids to different youth groups, they would come back and they would tell me some of the things we'd always ask them, like, what'd you guys learn tonight? And it was always, always, always some kind of relevant current event topic, like suicide or depression,
right,
or, transgenderism, or, and it was like they were just bombarding these kids with all these relevant topics, so that they could talk it like it was like a youth therapy session or something, as opposed to just getting them in there and teaching them sound doctrine. And I'm not bragging. I don't want to seem like I'm bragging, but when Kim took over the youth department and she started doing it, what she did was she focused on teaching doctrine. And those kids took off. I mean, they flourished because they were learning sound doctrine, and I think that's probably what we're looking at here. This comment probably about that is because these guys come out of, wherever they're coming from, and they just want to be relevant. We got to have, I went to Dallas and toured this place, and I'm not joking. We went into the youth. They had a youth building, not a youth room. They had a youth building.
Wow.
Double-decker basketball court in this thing. Full basketball court, double-decker. Like you had a gate around the whole thing. You could see both of them stacked on top of each other. And in this youth room, they had their own 500-seat auditorium. They had where they could watch movies and do sermons and do worship and all that. They had their own operated coffee shop. They had their own bookstore. They had their own, it was like this world.
Yeah.
Right.
That you could just
church.
leave your parents and not have to worry about them, and just kind of, and it's like, no wonder these kids have developed a worldview that is not biblical.
Right.
Because all we've done is entertain them for the last 30 years.
I mean, is it a wonder people don't want to grow out of youth and don't want to become? I mean, it used to be, hey, I want to go off into manhood. I want to go into the real world. And It reminded me at work, I had this coworker who was letting his son play baseball, which, I grew up playing baseball, but he's soccer and wrestling. And I'm like, well, are you worried about these sports? He's like, nah, I'm pretty sure he's not going to like it. I'm like, seriously,
What?
You're going to take this kid, let him be competitive. You're going to pay for all the gear. All he's got to do is get chauffeured and then hang out with buddies and compete. And you think he's not going to like this sport because it's not fun? He's like, yeah, I'm pretty sure. I'm like, all right, we'll see how that goes. And of course, 4 months later, he's like, yeah, he's trying out for All-Stars and we got more games to go to. And I'm like, yeah, of course he would. So I think we fail. That's what I love about what Kim does with my kids are in Miss Kim's classes. It's putting the aim point into the congregation where I'm trying to teach you so now you can garner the truths that are going to be preached. Like, let's aim for that. And let's not aim for this entertainment, social issues, this eternal youth. That's where, and how do you blame these kids when they go to college and become snowflakes and don't want to get into the real world? I mean, why would you want to leave that world, honestly?
Yeah, for real. It's good because like when I was going through the survey, when I came to the end of it and they were talking about, churches that actually have pastors with biblical worldviews and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, yeah, we fall into all those categories. Yeah. I mean, it's like, I feel like if we had taken this survey, we would have done okay. Yes. I feel like, yeah. What they discovered though, and George Barna was quoting this, and he discovered that 7 out of every 8 of those youth pastors lacked a biblical worldview, which helps to explain why so few people in the nation's youngest generations are developing a heart and mind for biblical principles and way of life, and why our society seems to have run wild over the last decade in particular. So I have a quote here, if it'll play, where George Bonner is commenting on youth pastors.
Children's and youth pastors, where only 12% have a biblical worldview. So that means that 7 out of every 8 of the pastors who are working with children do not have a biblical worldview. And that troubles me so much because it's between the ages of 15 to 18 months and 13 years of age that a person develops their worldview that they're going to carry with them for the rest of their life. So we know, as you alluded to earlier, that parents, by and large, are not helping to shape the biblical worldview of their children. And now we see that their children's and youth pastors aren't either.
Well, there you go.
Can I comment on something he said with that?
Yeah.
I wasn't here for the parent one, but I imagine this was talked about. I think one of the greatest sleights of hand that has been pulled in the fallen world system is this belief that experts are required in every arena of life.
Yeah.
Like when COVID happened, we got to defer to the medical expert, can't make your own decision. When it comes to your kids, like you can't raise your kids. And that's within the church as well, right? I mean, how many parents do we have within our own congregation that aren't taking the reins of their kids' spiritual life and have this literally take a back seat, drop their kids off? And as wonderful as Kim's class is, wonderful as our preaching may be, it's not going to be enough if they're not taking the reins and being the one who guides their kid in the discipleship process.
Yeah. The parents have to take charge of what's going on. And that was even more terrifying because the parents were in a worse situation than the youth pastors, it seemed like. Yeah, because they're not getting what they are looking for as well. Because, I mean, overall, slightly more than a third, 37% of all pastors have a biblical worldview, and a majority, 62%, possess a hybrid worldview known as syncretism.
Which, if I can, I want to read this. This is from Unity Houston. You ever heard of Unity Church?
Yeah, I think I've heard of it, but
just
not familiar with it.
So listen, it's hard to find their doctrine, but this is what they have when you go to about them. At Unity, everyone is recognized as a true spiritual being, awakening to the truth that sets them free. We strive to present a positive, practical, and progressive approach to Christianity. If you have been searching for a love-focused place of worship that embraces all people and honors all spiritual paths, Unity could be your answer.
Wow.
Perhaps here you will find what so many others have, the feeling you have come home. We believe that every person is a creation of God and capable of being a light in this world. Therefore, At one's core is a divine nature of goodness that every person is either asleep or attuned to in varying degrees. A deepening conscious relationship with God helps this God seed or divine nature to blossom. Life is for learning and growing spiritually. We hope you will join us at one of our services, and we want you to know you are welcome here.
Yeah, that's progressive Christianity for you. Yep, that's what that is.
I mean, how do you read the Bible, which says there are many paths that lead to death? There's one way to life, and then have a line in here that says we honor all spiritual paths. Like, I mean, let's not even say who's right, who's wrong at this phase. I'm just saying, how can you be consistent and embrace, say, your Christianity and do something completely in contradiction to what Jesus says?
Yeah. It is kind of a very kind of nefarious way of creating a new kind of religion that embraces some of Christianity, but actually creates a whole different kind of philosophy. I mean, these are not Christian churches.
No.
Yeah, I mean,
but they are if you ask them.
Well, yeah, exactly. And it's just kind of like the Mormon church. You know, the Mormon church is the same way. You know, I mean, it's like we say that we're Christians because we believe that Jesus Christ was a thing, but actually the Jesus Christ that you talk about is not the Jesus Christ of the Bible. It's the Jesus Christ that you have created to fit your model of what you want to believe. And so, no, they're not Christian churches.
Right.
Well, couldn't you say that they're actually taking the game you were talking about with your sage and turning it on to the Christian church? That it's not about doctrine. It's not about what the word says. It's about the experience you have. So we're creating an experience that appeals to your feelings, that appeals to your desires, that draws you in, and you want to be a part of that. You don't want to be a part of the doctrine.
No,
you don't want to be obedient to the word.
Well, that's
you
not
want to have a feel-good experience.
That's not like really a super selling point either. You know, it's like you don't, like if I were to put a thing out on Facebook that says, "Hey, come to Athol Baptist Church so you can learn sound doctrine." Mm-hmm. You know, people aren't going to flock to that. You know, it's not like, you know, it's like people are, oh yes,
that's what I was looking for.
Lectures, I can't wait. You know, and so it's not like super appealing, and especially if you have kids. You know, I mean, there's an allure to that kind of mentality because it's loving and it's accepting and it's embracing, and you're not going to get a lot of judgment, or you're not going to get a lot of conviction, and things of that nature. And so, yeah, I can see where they're coming from.
Well, it's a fine line, right? Because the people who come to our church, when we meet them, why did they come? They came because the preaching is solid, open, biblical, no nonsense. But they're also having an experience at the same time because they experience the love and the value we place on their kids and all of that kind of thing. So you kind of have to have a foot in both worlds a little bit. And I think it's upon the parents to be discerning. What are you actually looking for? Are you looking for an experience? Are you looking for truth?
But wouldn't you say that when you're correctly teaching the doctrine, the experience will be a necessary side effect, whereas when you lift up the experience and doctrine's not a factor, then you have to embrace this.
Then you're just legalist.
I think it's a total package. I don't think that you can do just sound doctrine. I think that you have to have sound doctrine with an illustration of real Christianity. I think that's what it boils down to. Right. You know, if you have those two things, if you have sound teaching, and you have a genuine Christian experience, that's what you're looking for.
Yeah.
You know, not a show, not a you're not looking for it's not. We have some struggles here right now talking about worship pastors and things and what we want out of worship, and I've heard people say that it's not a show. You know, we don't want a show. You know, and it's like, well, okay, that's fine. I hear what you're saying. However, you can't deny that what we currently have is aiding in the overall genuine Christian experience that we have. And I think that's what it boils down to. You got to have both. Mm-hmm. You can't have one or the other. And I think what happens is on this side, you have people that shift all the way to one side where it's just all about the experience. It's all about what you walk away with. It's all about how you feel when you walk away. And then on the other side of that equation, you have people that have drifted to the opposite side of that, where it's not about the experience at all. It's just about the teaching. Well, good luck with that.
Right.
Good luck with keeping people involved in that, because nobody wants to be a part of something like that. It's not only is it dull, but there's no community in that. And so people are looking for that as well. And of course they are, because they're made in the image of God. So why wouldn't they be looking for that?
Yeah.
You know, so it's not falling to one side or the other. You know, I mean, it's kind of like politics. You know, you have these two extremes that have kind of been created: progressive Christianity and legalistic Christianity, and both of those have different variations all in between there, ways that people approach ministry philosophy. But what I'm finding is that the way that creates biblical worldviews is like right in the middle of that somewhere.
With truth prioritized.
Right.
In community.
Yeah.
You know, and that's kind of what we have focused on here, and it's garnered some great results in maturity wise, you know what I mean? But it's terrifying to me that's not the norm. You know, I mean, that's the exception to the rule.
Well, I think part of it is the world's ability to take a word like doctrine and make it, I mean, think about just saying that word, and most people shudder with absolute fear and dread. Like, doctrine. It's going to eat your soul.
Well,
But what does doctrine provide? It provides boundaries. It provides safety. And that's where the doctrine of marriage, right? That's what we preach. Sexual gratification, happiness, emotional, all this is found in the marriage. And when you have a strong biblical worldview of how God intended marriage, biological man, biological woman, covenant for life, and working that, you know, we're doing that with love and respect with Pastor Ken. Like, when you work through that, that's where you build your character. That's where all the harmony, that's where so much is developed. But you look at churches that have a very, let's say, very soft view on marriage, like, oh, divorce is going to happen, and, you know, it's no big deal. You know, not to say that people shouldn't be forgiven when they're divorced and et cetera, but just not being very hard on people to say, hey, God hates divorce, and you should be striving with it should be priority one in your life to restore your marriage. You know, and I understand with abuse, there's got to be separation, there's got to be protection, all that stuff. That is an obvious thing. So I think the challenge, as pastors, and we talked about it, is to the average person, when you say we're going to teach doctrine, they think we've gone way right to legalistic Christianity, we're just bash people over the head, which, no, obedience unlocks understanding, and that's where you find joy when you've placed yourself in the shelter of God's truth, which is found in doctrine. Because I was saying in your earlier example with the progressive Christianity and legalistic Christianity, I wouldn't say those are genuine Christianity, because I think genuine Christianity, how can you not have truth and joy that comes from community?
Yeah, it would be. That's definitely not the model of what Christianity should look like, and certainly there's no room for hatred and malice in the Christian church, you know. And so there's all kinds of extreme examples, and you know, there's all kinds of examples of hypocrisy, and you know, and failing of groups and things of that nature that have led people to doubt the Bible, doubt Christianity. I mean, gosh, you look back at the last, 30 years, you have the Jimmy Swaggarts of the world, and you have, all these different, televangelists now.
Who is the Liberty guy, the Liberty president? Falwell? Is it Falwell?
Yeah, Jerry Falwell.
The junior, the one who was like, his wife was going to Miami and all that craziness. Yeah.
But, I mean, with the rise of prosperity gospel as well, the Creflo Dollars of the world and the
jet.
What's the guy in Houston? What's his name? Joel Osteen, and then you got Duplantis, and you got all those guys. I mean, it's like, can you put yourself in the position of a lost person looking at that? That's all you see. That's what you see, and then you look at that and you're like, well, yeah, I can definitely see where Christianity has some deep flaws, and yeah, of course it does that,
You become a cynic, skeptic, or scoffer.
Yeah, exactly.
So refer back to a couple of weeks ago where we talked all three.
Yeah. So it makes sense to me that a person in today's society would have a very low likelihood of having a biblical worldview.
Yeah.
What doesn't make sense to me is how can you have a group of pastors trained in either the church or in seminary walk out of that without a biblical worldview, or with some kind of synchronistic kind of idea of a worldview, as opposed to the Bible is truth, and let's build our worldview off of that. I don't understand how that happens. Like, where's the breakdown coming from that? Like, certainly they didn't walk out of seminary.
I don't know about that.
Maybe they did. I don't know.
I think it's increasingly being the source is the seminaries. Who was we were talking to? It was the guy in DePaul who said, when we were talking about media.
Oh, yeah.
That the corruption of the media is happening in the universities, and they're coming out as social warriors. Well, I think that's bled over into a lot of seminaries as well.
Yeah, because seminaries
that's where they're getting
striving for the federal monies as well, and so they are bending the knee
or catering to society's wants for.
And a lot of the seminaries
syncretism.
are not, though. Like the Southern Baptist Seminary is not striving for federal dollars, but yet they're still teaching. There's still groups in there that are teaching social justice kind of mentalities, and so there's these different worldviews like critical theory that are seeping into those as well, So, I have strong opinions about seminary at this point. I've done it, but it's like, why does that even exist? Why is that a thing? Mm-hmm. At what point did we determine that a diploma or a doctorate was what you needed in order to demonstrate that you were qualified to be in ministry? And now it's gotten to the point now where, like, if you go online and you look to be a pastor somewhere, one of their requirements is going to be master's or higher in divinity or theology.
Well, that's the expert syndrome you were talking about, right?
Right, yeah. No, bleeds over. I had a good experience in both my seminaries, on Southern California Seminary, Southern Evangelical Seminary, so I felt as blessed. I thought they were both very honest, kind of like I believe their primary mission was holding the truth, and I think they weren't always so worried about bringing in capital or increasing their population, et cetera, and so they didn't get as big as they probably could have if they would have started to say, hey, we're going to bend on a lot of stuff so we can get more students. So I think maybe I haven't studied this, but I would imagine that's a key piece of it is, it's just like when you build a huge church, right? Now you got to pay for the youth pastor, you got to pay for the equipment, you got to pay for the lights, and now we have to get butts in seats. Mm-hmm. And same thing with these colleges. They take huge loans to get buildings, they got all this professor staff, and if they don't put enrollment numbers, they're going to start, like, they're not going to be able to have the seminar. So I would imagine that is caused some of the dissipation of the biblical truth they're teaching.
Yeah. But I think what I was more leaning towards was the idea that these seminaries have now become the targeted place to find leadership.
Right.
It's like they have supplanted the church in the training up of pastors. I'm not convinced that that's the biblical model. Right. That you should send someone off to some seminary somewhere that has no kind of church authority. This is just a parachurch organization for all intents and purposes. Right. That is outside of the authority of the local church, and they're teaching the pastors to go out and understand that either by actual literal teaching or by demonstration that the church is secondary to the seminary. I think that it was something that there's a lot of ways that the church has messed up over the last century, and that to me is one of them. Youth ministry is one. The dependence on seminaries and colleges is another. It's like kind of like we fell back to looking like the world almost, and like you guys have universities, we're going to have universities too. And I'm not opposed to the teaching of the universities. Don't get me wrong. I think that, a lot of the things that I learned and a lot of the things that you learned, I mean, they're valid, but that being said, when you do something outside of the auspices of the church, you shouldn't be surprised that you garner results that are not favorable to the church. And I'm wondering if that's like one of the big parts of that, that, I mean, how do you get to a point where 62% of pastors possess a syncretistic worldview?
Do you think, I know we're a little different on our opinions on seminary, but I think what I'm hearing and what I agree with is a wise church would select someone from their own congregation and raise them up, then that would be the person. Because I think seminary, if it's done correctly, they go for intensive study. It's a beautiful thing. But I think, I agree with you, we've created this kind of free market where this random pastor goes up, gets all these quals, and he goes in this open market to whatever. And so he goes to this church not knowing who these people are, not having any loyalty. And then it's like, okay, I'm going to go from you to here to, you know what I mean? It's like, I'm going to start out at low level. I imagine that's probably created a lot of the issues as well.
Well, yeah, and then you go into a church as a seminary graduate, you're expecting to make 5 figures, so all small churches are cut out. It's like you're definitely not going to a small church.
Right.
You're going to some place that can afford to pay you for your expertise.
Right.
So that feeds into the big church mentality. And then you get into a church, you're brand new, you don't know any of these people, you don't know their character, you don't know their lives, you don't know anything about them. It's going to take you at least 3 to 5 years to build any type of respected leadership. Leadership that goes beyond just your title, like leadership that is like you have earned. And so, it takes you 5 years to earn that type of leadership. In the interim, while you're learning, or you're gaining that type of leadership, you're disrespected and you're not given your proper, authority, and people are always talking about you and, always coming down on you or whatever. And so then you're like, okay,
you're
I'm done.
saying pastors don't have absolute sway over their congregation.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
What that
especially,
sounds like.
especially within 3 to 5 years, right? But then, what's the recidivism of pastors? It's typically 3 to 5 years.
You know what that sounds like? Corporate America.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
CEOs bouncing from company to company to accomplish a mission, come in, get the job done, update, go to the next higher salary.
It's very rare to see a pastor that has been in his position for more than 8 years.
Yeah.
That's really rare. That's the exception. And no wonder, I think probably a lot of these guys that have gotten to this point have probably been in ministry for 15, 20 years, bounce from church to church, and a lot of their experiences that they now have and a lot of the ideas that they now have been formulated by what they have experienced from the church itself. I know that my viewpoints have changed over the last 25 years on a lot of different things, and so my worldview has changed. I'd like to think that it's changed closer to a biblical worldview, but there's obviously things that change in your worldview, and I'm wondering, it's like, if that's the case, and this is kind of the way that you're focused, and then no wonder, that 37%, only 37% hold the biblical worldview, because why would you?
So in that chart you're looking at, executive pastor, I assume, what's the difference between executive pastor and the senior pastor?
I looked this up because this has been a discussion at our church about changing my title from senior pastor to something else, because there's a group of people that feel like senior pastor is pastor of old people. Yeah. So we've been kicking around, different ideas for that. And one of them was executive pastor. However,
and then you look at that and it's like, do I want to be associated with these guys?
Not just that, but the executive, what's interesting is that the job description of an executive pastor is a pastor who focuses on policy, procedure, and administrative tasks. It's just like what we were talking about. He's a CEO.
Yeah.
And when you have that kind of business mentality, it seems like the closer you get to that, the less worldview that you have that's biblical.
Sounds more like a deacon than a pastor. I mean, honestly.
Super deacon.
Maybe. I see the need. Like Ken and I were talking about this. It would be nice if I had a pastor on staff that focused on going to finance committee, focused on going to church council and organizing, communicating with those guys, helping to train them, worked on policies and procedures, writing and observing and, all that kind of stuff, I mean.
Glad I would never qualify for that.
Your name,
you might get voluntold.
Your name got brought up.
Well, I'd get fired fairly quickly. It's like, so have you even read this policy? Like, no, it's not my thing.
Hey, Richard, why are these 20 red folders stacked up in your box? Yeah. So there is one group that in the general public that is more likely to possess a biblical worldview than the pastors, and they are what's called sage cons.
Is this a made up term, by the way?
I don't know. I've never heard of sage cons, but it makes sense to me. I think that we have a lot of them in our communities. Known as spiritually active governance engaged conservative Christians.
I mean, honestly,
that's a massive.
There's got to be a better way to identify that.
Well, the survey showed that 46% of sage cons have a biblical worldview, a full 9 percentage points higher than pastors. Sage cons constitute about 8% of the national adult population, and pastors of Christian churches are less than 1% of the general public. So sage cons with a biblical worldview are roughly 10 times as numerous as Christian pastors with a biblical worldview. That's terrifying. Just average people that are active in governance. And I'm guessing these are like politically active Christians. Is that what we're looking at here? And they apply their biblical worldview to their politics, are more numerous, 10 times more numerous than pastors.
And they should be. Worldview. They should be even more than that.
They should be. Yeah, it should be more than that. But
I think they're saying within
influence is concerned.
But I think they're saying within a sample, if you took 100 pastors and you took 100 sage cons, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying.
You would have half of the sage cons with a worldview, and where you have less than half with pastors.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. The percentages don't play out, which is leading to more or a lack of biblical worldview all the way around the board. So Barna had a comment to say about mentors in dealing with this, and let's see what he had to say and see if we got a comment on it.
One of the things that we've learned over the last few years and all the research we're doing, now I understand it better now that we have this research in hand, is that those people who have a biblical worldview, it has been largely shaped through the coaching or mentoring of another individual who has that biblical worldview and is willing to come alongside them and not only teach it to them, but also model it for them and help them to be accountable for the choices that they're making.
Yeah, so what he's saying there is these people have mentors that come along and teach them what it looks like to have a biblical worldview. But who is mentoring these people if the pastors aren't mentoring anybody to have a biblical worldview,
Yes, that's problematic because, he's supposed to be the shepherd of the flock, and if he's guiding them to the wrong pasture, then everybody just following and...
Yeah. Now, there is some good news. Baptist churches, which are widely regarded as among those most likely to embrace the Bible as God's inerrant word, did not live up to that stereotype. Slightly less than 1/2 of the pastors serving at Baptist churches have a biblical worldview. The exception was pastors of Southern Baptist churches.
Yeah.
Where about 3/4, 78%, have consistently biblical beliefs and behavior.
Representing.
Yeah, the survey discovered that pastors of smaller congregations are more likely than those of larger congregations to have a biblical worldview as well. So your community does matter,
right,
is what I'm seeing.
Size does matter.
Size matters.
In a very applied, practical way as far as doctrine and truth are concerned.
Right. I'm looking at this, right? And so it's like the percentages drop off precipitously. So it's like if you have 100 or fewer adults, you have a 41% chance of having a biblical worldview. If you have more than 251 adults in your service, you have about 15% of pastors had a biblical worldview. Now, I'm not sure that this number plays out because, like, if you look at the if you have 250 or less, there's a 42% chance that you have a biblical worldview. If you have 601 or more adults, it's 15%. 251 to 600 adults is 14%. 101 to 250 adults is 45%. So it's like,
I think what that is showing is the bottom two rows are the averages of
the
upper
averages
brackets.
of the upper brackets.
Right.
Just kind of
Right. And so then
juicing it down.
And then you have like the four major ones are up at the top, right?
So in other words, we put that on the court board out front, and when the 251st person comes through, we beat them with whips and drive them away.
Drive them away. Yeah, because like 250 is like the benchmark. Like if you get over 250, then it just starts going downhill from there.
Right.
Yeah, which makes sense because, man, dealing with 250 people.
Yes. Get away, ye 11.
251. We have reached our limit. No more. I think that's probably true. I think that the more people that you get, the more lenient that you have to be on your worldview.
Mm-hmm.
You have to
just get spread too thin.
Mm-hmm. And you start having to make adjustments to keep, like what you were saying, keep people in the seats, because you have to keep people in the seats.
Yeah.
And once you get to a certain point, you don't really have a choice. You have to expand. You have to grow. We're there.
Yeah.
That's what we're battling with right now is the ethics of growing past the point where we're at.
Right. There's definitely exceptions to the rule, though. Obviously, I mean, where I came from in South Carolina at the Community Bible Church with Dr. Carl Brogy, I mean, you can watch his stuff, searchthescripture.org, and he's just, I mean, he is definitely like, one of the things I remember him saying is like, look, I'm not here to give you candy. I'm here to give you the broccoli of the world, the broccoli of the word, so get ready. And, I mean, it's spot on in the whole church, and they have a very thriving and what would be considered a mega church, but they're very hard.
Hard to find those.
It's very hard to find and very in line with how we are. So they're out there, just not as much.
I think if you approach it with caution and you approach it with a level of reverence, it's like if God wants us to grow past a certain point, then it's got to be God that does it. It can't be us that forces it.
Exactly.
And then it's got to be done in such a way that you don't lose the character of what's gotten you here, because I think that's what happens.
Yeah.
It's like you lose that character and then you become a corporation. And then everything, like especially when you start shifting over to a multi-campus kind of philosophy, it's not about a pastoral staff anymore, an elder board anymore. It's about the board of directors.
Right.
And I would wager to say that most megachurches with multiple campuses have a board of directors that lead the corporation.
Right.
Yeah, you have to be very intentional about community and the things that got you there, or you'll lose them.
Yep. And I think that it's unavoidable. It doesn't matter how many, gymnasiums that you build or, how many soccer fields you build or how many, community centers that you build. Eventually you just become a large group of people.
Yeah. It's interesting to me. It's like looking at this, how many churches would have the wisdom and the humility to say, hey, we're kind of at the tipping point. Wouldn't it be more beneficial for us to train up a pastor, send him out, allow him to build his own church, through God's blessing, and we'll be partners with him? But wouldn't that be more wise than to start this whole prideful mega church satellite, like everything's got to be,
Yeah, that's kind of been my beef with satellite churches from the very beginning. You get to a certain point where it's like, it's just everything coming back to Rome. It's kind of like a quasi ecumenicism where you have different like satellites kind of, teaching in their own communities. This kind of rose with the small group movement,
right?
Which is probably where you get a lot of the home group movement at. But you have all these kind of like places kind of rising up, applying themselves to the culture of that community. But then in reality, what's happening is all of that is funding the kind of main organization as a corporation so that they can continue to keep building and growing. And as it builds and grows, you have to make more, you have to put more butts in seats So let's make another, church, let's make another satellite, and I've often thought about that myself. It's like, instead of building a new satellite to kind of feed the massive organization that is definitely breeding people that don't have a biblical worldview, which is obviously what we're seeing here, based on this data, instead of feeding that model, why not build up leaders that are biblically sound and then let them go and start their own churches, carve off, people from this community and say, hey, look, you guys are going to need to start going and supporting this church, and building it from there. That seems like a biblical model to me.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not what pastors have been taught over the last few decades.
Right.
It's foster small groups in a community, and then once you have fostered small groups in a community, when it gets large enough, we're going to build a satellite church there to house all of those small groups. That's the model, and it's effective. It works. Who can blame them for doing that? Because it's obviously it works. But is it producing a biblical worldview in Christians? And obviously, based on the data,
not so much.
It is not.
Right.
And you can't deny that mega churches, satellite churches, churches with people 2,000 or more are definitely affecting these numbers in larger groupings than smaller churches with pastors who might not have great worship, who are, have like 10 or 12, people in their congregation. They're not affecting these numbers to any large degree.
Right.
The people who are there, these 2,000 people, I would wager that a vast majority of them were going to some church that had 2,000 or more, or were a larger kind of congregation. It would be interesting to see that.
It'd also be interesting to see, maybe this information, like, has there been a definitive, like, let's say there's 3 categories, 100 and less, 250 less, 250 more. It seems like there's been a shift from a lot fewer smaller churches, 100 less, 250 less, and a lot more percentage of churches that are big? Or is it?
No, that's actually not true. The data from the Northwest Baptist Convention illustrates that churches that would be considered mega churches that are 2,000 people or more make up less than 1% of churches.
Oh, wow.
Yep. And
in the Northwest.
In the Northwest.
But like in the Northeast or the
But
Southeast?
still, that number even in the Southeast is still pretty small.
Is it?
But that's just like of churches. That doesn't necessarily make up the bulk of the demographic of the churches, because those churches do consume a majority of the Christians in those communities. So it's not a reflection of the total number of Christians. It's just a number of churches that are these things. But the vast majority of churches, the large majority of churches, are churches with like 50 or less.
Yeah.
Really? Wow.
Yep, that's the bulk of churches, particularly in the Northwest.
Small town America is the sleeping giant, in my mind.
Yep. And I think that what they try to do with like associations and conventions and things like that is unite those smaller churches into one kind of cooperative program, which was the basis of the cooperative program for the Southern Baptist Convention.
That is now
compromised.
Going off the rail.
Yeah, we'll see what happens with that. But, obviously the 1% of churches are having the largest effect of these numbers. I mean, you look at Joel Osteen's church. I mean, that church is just
massive.
What is it, 50,000 people in congregation? I mean, it's like a football stadium. It's like a basketball stadium that he's converted into a church.
Yeah. Well,
and it's full. 2 services.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it kind of is beginning to mirror our nation, right? In a way, the deep blue pockets are found in the cities. And if you look at all maps, like every state, almost to a T, is completely red except for the blue parts of the city.
Yeah.
And everything is being driven by that. So geography-wise, I mean, we're massively deep red. But because we have these small, obviously populated deep pockets of blue, that's driving the entire thing.
Yeah, well, they're all collected together. So when you and that's the kind of the the problem of individualism, like especially in the Northwest, it's like people like to be individualistic and we like to be on our own. And there's great benefits to being an independent church because you're not tied to any kind of denomination. We don't have any kind of requirements to any kind of larger organization. They don't control what we preach. They don't control our doctrine. Right. We do that, but the other side of that is that it makes cooperation difficult, because you don't have like something large that you're contributing to or that you're a massive part of, which is why the Northwest Baptist Convention exists, why we do that, because it gives us an opportunity to cooperate and do greater things. Yeah. But still, it's obviously these large congregations are affecting this kind of mentality in very, very deep ways. And then where these guys are getting their training from, getting back to pastors, 1/3 or more of senior pastors believe the following. Now this is gonna freak you out. We're talking about senior pastors of churches. 1/3 or more believe that sexual relations between two unmarried people who believe that they love each other is morally acceptable. That determining moral truth is up to each individual. There are no moral absolutes that apply to everyone all of the time. I mean, these guys are just postmodernists, really. Right. Is what it boils down to. The Holy Spirit is not a living entity, but is a symbol of God's power, presence, or purity. That having faith matters more than which faith you have.
Back to unity.
Mm-hmm. That reincarnation is a real possibility.
That
would be terrifying.
Where did that come from? It is possible to reach complete spiritual maturity during our time on earth. Yeah, good luck with that.
Yes.
Got any examples?
Yeah.
I'd like to see.
Can you show me somebody? A person who is generally good or does good enough things for others can earn a place in heaven. They are willing to try just about anything once. Socialism is preferable to capitalism. Allowing property ownership facilitates economic justice. Injustice, right. Sorry, I read that wrong. The Bible is ambiguous in its teachings about abortion, enabling you to make a strong argument either for or against abortion based on biblical principles. 1/3 or more of senior pastors do not believe that human life is sacred, that wealth is entrusted to individuals to be managed for God's purpose, that success is consistent obedience to God, and that people are born into sin and can only be saved from its consequences by Jesus Christ. They personally will experience eternal salvation only because they have personally confessed their sins and accepted Jesus Christ as Savior. Only 1/3 of pastors do not. 1/3 of pastors or more do not believe those things.
Scary.
Let's just let that soak in for a minute, because that's the core of why we have a postmodernist society, is because at some point it became unimportant to teach biblical truth.
Right.
And what happened? Where did that come from? It'd be interesting to look at the history of the church over the past few decades and kind of determine where the breakdown was,
Yeah, it'd be hard to pinpoint. I mean, I've heard a pastor say that the gender confusion and the alternate lifestyle that we're experiencing now is a product of the 60s. You know what I mean? So, like, how many decades back does this go, our disregard for elevating, or our disregard for biblical truth and elevating unity and ecumenism over being faithful to God's truth?
Yeah, this like kind of we're all on the same team kind of mentality.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I've experienced that. The desire for ecumenicism, especially in the chaplaincies. If you get into chaplaincy any at all, you find that you're working side by side with people from different denominations that have completely opposing views to yourself, religious ideals. And so, you have to
And I imagine you're pressured into like, it's not about the faith. You're basically, we want you to be a counselor, not
we want you to help people and not, proselytize people. Yeah, that's the whole point of it, And so there's this big giant push for unity and coming together. I just think it's when you have 1/3 or less, or 1/3 or more of senior pastors who do not believe that human life is sacred.
Right.
I'm not sure where you go from there. I think one of the things that needs to happen is we need to admit that I think the church in general, whether it is a Protestant church or an evangelical church or, whatever brand of church that it might be, if it teaches the gospel of Jesus Christ as the way to salvation, then the first thing that we have to do is we have to admit that we failed. We failed in our mission to do what God has told us to do. 100%. You look at what's going on in our world today, and you look how, and maybe that's part of the deal, maybe there is a great falling away and that's part of what happens. And I don't know that you can turn it around at this point, but obviously, based on what I'm seeing here data-wise, the church has failed to disciple people. It's failed to teach people what a biblical worldview is. And instead of teaching people what a biblical worldview is we've given the church community whatever it desires.
Latitude.
So that it can feel comfortable coming to church and being a part of that community and enjoying it. And the gospel is not being preached.
Yeah. Otherwise the harvest would be in. We wouldn't be sitting here.
Exactly. We wouldn't be talking about this. The proof is in the pudding, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like what happened with the whole Brownsville revival. You guys remember that? The Brownsville revival and the speaking in tongues and the people getting slain in the spirit.
Huge, even up here.
Yeah, and like down in Pensacola, where Brownsville was at, you could drive by there and people would just be lined up down the street to get into this place, to experience what God was doing in there. And you would think that if there was a revival of that magnitude going on, that there would be a change in the way that God was operating in the immediate vicinity. Like people would be getting saved, or like the community would change, or like, something would happen. Crime would go down, or, charitable, giving would go up, or, like something, like homelessness would be eliminated. You'd think there would be some actual like benefit to the community.
Right.
But there was none. Nothing happened. And not only did nothing happen, but it got worse. Yeah. And so I think that's what you see in this data. It's like you can't say that the church is doing its job and look at this data. It's just not. Numbers don't lie to you.
Right. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, as you were talking about, we have to accept the responsibility. I was reminded of a conviction I had when I was reading Daniel. And I think it was before he was thrown into the den. I can't remember exactly which portion it was, but he was having a very fervent prayer and accepting the responsibility of the nation of Israel's failure to, worship God and to be righteous before God. And it convicted me then, and you just reminded me of how we're building this very individualistic society. I'm not even saying narcissism. I'm just saying I was convicted myself. Like, how many times am I praying for Athol Baptist? How many times am I praying for something greater than just my own struggles? Like, I spent so much time just focused on me, right? That for you to say at first when I hear that it's our church's fault, I'm like, what are you talking? It's not my fault. Like, oh wait, I'm part of something bigger, right? And I think we in this society with Facebook and all this narcissism, this push towards individualism, I think you're exactly right. We've lost sight that it's more than about us, and we've lost this corporate responsibility, this corporate commitment.
And it's even more nefarious than that, because if you embrace that corporate mentality and you embrace the idea that the church is family and that you are working together in something that's greater than yourself, you get labeled as a cult. Yeah, it's true. We have a Google review of a girl that thinks that we're a cult as opposed to a church. Yeah. And it's probably, I would say, probably related to the fact that we are very serious about our relationship with one another, about being something larger than yourself, about fruits of the Spirit. It's interesting when you say that, because, I mean, if you look at the model prayer, how much of the model prayer is focused on the self?
Very little.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, forgive my debts as I forgive my debtors. That's it.
Just give me my bread.
Just give me my bread. Give me my daily bread. And then, that's good. Let me glorify God. And, you're right. And the narcissism of social media has only amplified that over time. Yeah.
So, I'm so terrified for my kids.
Yeah. It's a cesspool. I get on it less and less as time goes on, because it is just a cesspool of people just being nasty to each other and nonsense. But let's close it out. Let's see. Barna said this: to see American culture transformed will require a time of Christians and pastors devoted to repentance and the Scriptures, unlike anything we have seen in more than a century. And until that happens, there is little hope of America becoming a godly, Bible-friendly nation once again. He offered a note of hope in spite of the data. It says you cannot fix something unless you know it's broken. Other recent research we have found suggested most pastors believe that they are theologically in tune with the Bible. Perhaps these findings will cause many of them to take a careful look at how well their beliefs and behaviors conform to biblical principles and commands. I think that's what it's going to take. Mm-hmm. I think it is going to take pastors first as leaders of their flocks. Yeah. If you can hear what we're saying here today, take an honest assessment of your doctrinal beliefs, your theological ideas, and see if they line up with Scripture or if you have fallen into the trap of syncretism. And I think that a lot of them will find, if they're honest, that their views do not line up with the Bible. But that therein lies the problem, right?
That's how we define biblical worldview, right? It's submitting to the biblical truth. The Bible says one man, one woman for life, and that's it. Whether culture likes it or not, you like it or not, do you submit to that truth? That defines whether or not you have a biblical worldview. Yeah,
and in all areas of life, that
exactly.
And that extends into politics as well, and everything that we think and everything that we do and everything that we partake in, does it line up with Scripture? And until we do that, and quit letting the world, politics is a great example of this, because like I was in a thing looking at just different conversations the other day, and there's a Christian lady in there that I know that made a statement. They used to come to this church, and she made a statement that she doesn't believe that churches should be involved in politics at all, that they should be completely separate. And I was just flabbergasted that a Christian could think that. Like, how could you come to a point where you determined that it was not important for the church to speak into the leadership of our nation? Yeah. Where do you come up with that? Like, how is that a good idea? And I think they'll use the separation clause, establishment clause, to kind of justify that idea. But
again, the expert.
But that's just what I'm saying is like, until we wake up to the fact that the world cannot tell us what we can and cannot interject in, that the biblical worldview is going to feed into your politics, that it's going to happen. Mm-hmm. You can't prevent that. If you have a biblical worldview, it's going to affect who you vote for, period. Mm-hmm. There's nothing you can do about that. And so when they say, the church should not be involved in politics, like how? What are we supposed to do? We're supposed to teach people to not follow the Bible so that they have an atheist worldview when they go to the polls? Like, how's that going to work?
Right.
Good luck with that.
What's this fairy tale belief that if we just stay in our box, everything's going to be okay? We just stick our head in the sand. We're like, do you not recognize we're not of the world? We're in the world, and this affects politics and what's decided, policy affects the church's ability to witness, to do things. And it's just a level of ignorance that's unfortunate.
Don't be involved in politics until you can't have your freedom of religion anymore. See how that works out for you.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's just appalling, but that's the same type of mentality, you know, that Christians have. You know, it's like, until we're honest with ourselves and take responsibility for where we have failed and what we need to do, we're not going to correct this. I think he's right. You know, it starts with pastors honestly assessing what they're teaching in the pulpit and how their churches look, and determining, is this conducive to creating a biblical worldview? And I think that's how we will get to that point. You got any last words, Richard?
I do not. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, well, appreciate
Glad to have you, brother.
Yeah, appreciate you. Ken, got any last words?
And this survey was just kind of eye-opening to me. You know, I never would have thought it was this stilted. And so, yeah, it just it stirs up in me, like you say, a greater sense of responsibility, commitment to the truth, because it's not somebody else's problem. It's our problem.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And we can only change ourselves, and we can only influence our sphere. So double down on it and make sure that we're doing our job. And if every pastor takes that seriously, the problem will be solved.
Yeah, yeah. I hope that in spite of ourselves, that Christ gets lifted up at this church.
Yes.
And that it's not about personality, and it's not about, you know, leveraging celebrity or whatever the case may be. I hope that it's always about Christ being lifted up, because I think that does lead to part of the problem. When people look at the world and they've lifted up the Creflo Dollars of the world and the Joel Osteens of the world, and then these men are obviously flawed because they're human, you know, and then when they fall, you know, people are like, well, there you go, that's Christianity for you. You know, it's like, no, you know, Christianity is filled with flawed people. Look at David.
Right.
You know, I mean, nobody here is perfect. Nobody here intends to be perfect. I think when we're honest with ourselves and we're honest about our own failures, we're honest about our own flaws, and honest about how much we need grace, that'll go a long way in helping us to understand how a biblical worldview is so important and going forward in our lives. Mm-hmm. And I hope that that's what people get here at Athol Baptist Church is, you know, hey, look, we are trying our best to present a biblical worldview here. And that means Christ is lifted up in it. So I hope that's what people get. Well, that about does it for us today. As always, thank you for joining us. If you have any idea for an episode, or if you would like to hear us investigate or interview a guest, you can send us an email at 3p@atholbaptistchurch.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Ken. Thank you, Gavin, for helping us produce this episode. Thanks, Athol Baptist Church and its members for their generous support. And again, thank you for listening. Until next time, remember the Great Commission. Go into the world, reach the lost with the gospel, and build disciples who can do the same. And with that, we are out.